Okay.
Dear participants, in the following session, we will have our second lecture on the human condition by Siri Hustvedt. And once again, I would like to express a very warm welcome to her. Siri, I must tell you that yesterday, students I spoke to were very impressed by your thoughts and the way you look at the human being. They are really looking forward to listening to your next lecture. But today, before I start, I would like to introduce you as an author. To put it in a nutshell, Siri received her PhD in English from Columbia University with a dissertation on Charles Dickens. Her novels are translated into more than 30 languages, and she has received numerous awards, including the 2019 Princess of Asturias Award for Literature, which is a really prestigious Spanish award with a worldwide reputation. Before the corona pandemic started, young people frequently told me that after finishing school, they immediately felt as if they were being exposed to a totally new situation. One student put it this way: it is like having a whole new life in 1 week. It is an atmosphere where the present is the future, like hearing the feelings of the future coming into being. In 2019, Siri's semi-autobiographical novel, Memories of the Future, in German Damals, was published. The narrator, a young lady writing her first novel, describes what she knows now. As I wrote, I was also being written. Isn't that wonderful? As I wrote, I was also being written. By the way, the narrator of that novel left rural Minnesota for New York City in August 1978. Siri was born in Minnesota and now lives in Brooklyn, New York. Siri, I am really looking forward to hearing your next lecture.
Thank you, Professor Sommer, for a wonderful introduction again. And we are continuing with the imagination, but this part 2 is called Betweens. Categories, their definitions, and subsequent divisions make sense of our lives in the world. It is useful to think of categories as boxes with labels or names on them we employ to keep things in order. If mind is in one box and body in another, we have seen how difficult it is to find a place for the imagination. Does it belong in the box labeled body with its sensations and feelings, or in the box labeled reason? If we make a box for each one, we run into Descartes' dilemma of trying to put them back together again. What if imagination jumps between body and mind, or imagination and reason mingle with each other? If this is the case, do we need a new box with a new name, Imagicin or Reanation, to contain the mix? When 3-year-old Sophie imagined herself as an adult, wasn't her imagining also a form of reasoning about the future? Isn't thinking about the future always imagining, because once today becomes tomorrow, it is no longer the future? Aren't we always anticipating the future through our experiences of the past? Could some form of the imagination not be involved in thinking ahead? What do we do with the thing that doesn't fit a ready-made box? Most of us can identify a platypus, animal with its duck-like bill, fur, venomous claws, webbed feet, and heavy tail, so surprised the English naturalist George Shaw in 1799, he at first suspected the stuffed specimen he had received from New South Wales in Australia was a fake created by a clever taxidermist. Like Hobbes' centaur, the platypus seemed to be a fictional creature forged by mixing several species into one. No one knew how to classify it. Philosophers have tied themselves into knots thinking about natural kinds, something out there in the world that has an essential quality, which can be identified and separated from other things. This is the objectivist view dear to much of science. The world is made of objective things that can be known, identified, and pigeonholed. The observer of nature is able to stand outside it. The subject looks at the object. The ideal observer has no subjective qualities and no biases. The scientific method allows him to escape himself. Classification systems are essential because they define the objects of study. They put things that are alike into boxes, mineral, animal, or vegetable, which then have smaller boxes inside them for subcategories. Our fictional character, imagination, refuses to go politely into the box marked boy or the one marked girl and stay there quietly for the rest of their life. This young person falls between or among gender categories and refuses to be defined as either masculine or feminine. There are those who argue that sex is a natural kind and those who argue it is not. Organisms have many modes of reproduction. Some simply clone themselves, others are male and female in one, and still others, like the clownfish, are sequential hermaphrodites, creatures that can change sex over the course of a lifetime. Discovering the essence of male and female is not easy. Debates about category get messy. Although we acknowledge a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are both dogs, it is easy to imagine another system of classification that it would make it impossible to yoke such different-looking creatures. In an essay, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges cited an ancient Chinese encyclopedia, the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, probably the product of the author's imagination. The Emporium includes a complete classification of animals. Among the categories, those that belong to the emperor, that's one. Two, embalmed ones, innumerable ones, and those that have just broken the flower vase. The 18th century Swedish botanist and zoologist Carolus Linnaeus, we're talking 1707, 1778, is probably the most famous creator of a taxonomy in biology. Linnaeus was influenced by Aristotle's substance ontology. Essential properties exist. Those qualities a thing needs to have to be what it is, which can be distinguished from accidental properties that can be lost or gained without its substance changing. Linnaeus's Systema Naturae, the system of nature, was published in 12 editions beginning in 1735. In the 10th edition, this is 1758, he introduced the hierarchical groupings, kingdom, class, order, genus, and species. He invented the binomial system we still use, genus followed by species, Homo sapiens. He was the first to include human beings among animals and to link us to other primates. He also proposed a taxonomy in botany based on sex that involved counting stamens, male, and pistons, female. Linnaeus spiced up his lectures by eroticizing plants and giving them exciting sex lives. There were monogamous, polygamous, adulterous, and perverse plants. He compared pollen to male sperm and stigma to a woman's labia. Linnaean botany became hugely popular, especially in England, where many public discussions turned on whether young ladies should be allowed to gaze at plants' sexual parts. Linnaeus had an active imagination. Plants exchange gametes and they have chromosomes, but many rely on a third party, a pollinator like a bee, to reproduce. Plants also have asexual reproduction and gamete exchange within the same plant. So the resemblance to human beings is hardly obvious. In the 10th edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus divided human beings into varieties, not subspecies, by geography, Europe, America, Asia, and Africa, and assigned each of them defining physical and psychological features. He described the European as, quote, light, wise, inventor, and the African as, quote, sly, sluggish, and neglectful, end quote. He turned human variety, including skin color, into hierarchy with moral character and spurred the rise of scientific racism. Linnaeus imported imaginary, Eurocentric stereotypes into his science, although in earlier editions, Linnaeus had put the Europeans on the top of the list. In his famous 10th edition, he put the reddish Americanus first. An article on the subject published by the Linnaean Society of London speculates that the idea of the noble savage may have been behind the switch. Rousseau never used the term, but it was embedded in his philosophy of the good natural man. Taxonomy, any system of classification and order, has consequences. The science of sexual and racial categories that became codified in the 18th century, categories that presumably describe the essences of people who had bodily features, labia, vagina, uterus, skin color, skull size and shape, facial features, are responsible for centuries of prejudice and oppression. Imagine differences about an imaginary category, race, have led to bloody rebellions, wars, brutal laws, and genocide. Race is a fiction made real by history. Classification has consequences far beyond scientific bickering about what to do with the platypus. In the 18th century, a name was coined for a discipline to investigate things that refuse to fit neatly into a category. Teratology, the study of monsters. It remains a discipline today devoted to birth defects and their causes. But how do monsters come about? As the anthropologist Mary Douglas wrote, quote, anomalies are not installed in nature, but emerge from particular features of classificatory schemes. In order to create a monster, An anomaly by definition. The ready-made categories must exist first. Only then do you discover there is no box for what you have found. The platypus is now safely assigned to the category monotreme, but that designation took time. Although most people think of mathematics as a discipline of regularity, rules, logic, and absolute certainty, there are mathematical monsters too. Puzzles which emerge and explode the given categories. Henri Poincaré, the 20th century French mathematician, wrote the following, quote, "Logic sometimes makes monsters. For half a century, we have seen the rise of a crowd of bizarre functions which seem to try to resemble as little as possible the honest functions which serve some purpose," end quote. It is the honest functions that produce the monsters. The desire to classify phenomena, to identify natural kinds, to group like things, comes from an impulse to order the world. But taxonomy also hides a need to control or master the phenomena it treats, to divide and conquer. What we now call the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason during the 18th century in Europe was guided by the faith that subjectivity and feeling could be drained from science. This notion persists in the idea that science is value-free, that if you proceed by method and calculate correctly, you'll avoid all bias. But there is little in the history of science to suggest this is how it works. The fantasy of pure objectivity doesn't preclude discoveries, but those discoveries are always viewed from a particular perspective, which includes the situation of the scientist and the collective imagination of a culture with its notions of superior and inferior. Most of our prejudices are not fully conscious or are entirely unconscious. Sometimes they manifest themselves as feeling repugnance, irritation, or admiration for someone or something, which we then explain to ourselves on hindsight. This is how Vico understands his giants. The myth of Jove was born of bodily emotion projected outward and named. The mania for classification in 18th century Europe saw the birth of the museum and the encyclopedia, but also scientific racism and sexism. The science of sex and race grew in the 19th and 20th centuries, an era of measuring skulls and skeletons, weighing brains, and elaborate tabulations, such as IQ, that proved inferiority. The scientists and philosophers who did the measuring, weighing, and calculating were often unconscious that their work was influenced by their situation as white men of a certain class at a specific place and time. They were immersed in the collective ideas, myths, and institutions that help shape our perception. These debates are ongoing. For decades, Aristotle's ideas about women and slaves have been attacked and defended. The racism and sexism of both Hume and Kant are also subjects of lively scholarly discussion. The zeal for order and hierarchy, whether in science, philosophy, or politics, partakes of an anxiety about mixed and impure between states, an inability to tolerate that which isn't one thing or another, the thing that slips away into obscurity, which Dr. Johnson maintained baffles logicians, or a person like our character, imagination, who is sometimes avoided and treated as a kind of monster. Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, that's 1818, is the story of a monster so famous he walked out of the book and into the collective imagination. Many people who have never read the novel know him. The story, which came to its author in what she described as a waking dream, is about an unnatural birth. A scientist, Victor Frankenstein, cooks up his creature in his laboratory. After 2 years of secret labor, he manages to electrify and resurrect the body parts of corpses he has pieced together. But when his dream of infusing life into inanimate matter is realized, he is horrified. Frankenstein mistreats his giant offspring and then abandons him. Although by the end of the book, the creature has committed serial murder, he is also a sympathetic character, a tragic being who lives outside every category and is therefore relegated to an existence of absolute solitude. Frankenstein is another philosophical novel. The book combines Rousseau's idea of man's natural goodness with the empiricist doctrine of Hume, we are made of our experience. Like Rousseau's Emile, the monster begins his life with only physical needs and sensations. But over time, he gains an imagination and reflective self-consciousness. He is able to imagine himself through the eyes of other people. And it is this capacity that torments him. Quote, I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent united with riches, he says in the book. But I knew I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. When I looked around, I saw none and heard none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had remained in my native wood, nor known or felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. The nameless creature would have been happier in his natural state. We know Mary Shelley read Rousseau and Hume, and that the man who became her husband, the romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, read Vico, which means the Italian philosopher's ideas were at least floating in her vicinity. We also know she had read the Confessions and was, as were many others, horrified by Rousseau's abandonment of his children. Like one of Vico's giants or Rousseau's natural man, Shelley's creature is all sense and feeling in the beginning, but has no access to others. Although Rousseau's political philosophy turned on the collective will of the people and the right social context for equality and freedom, Rousseau celebrated solitude and became famous as a recluse. He never lived alone, actually. Thérèse Levasseur was with him and took care of him until the end of his life. What he shunned were intellectual salons and the corrupting influence of society. David Hume, who championed the benefits of social interaction, spent many long hours alone. At 23, he suffered a mental breakdown. One of his doctors blamed on long hours of solitude, quote, the disease of the learned. In his conclusion of part 1 of A Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, Hume, still in his 20s, wrote, quote, I am first affronted and confounded with that forlorn solitude in which I am placed in my philosophy, and fancy myself some strange, uncouth monster who is not able to mingle and unite in society and left utterly abandoned and disconsolate. Hume's monster may have influenced Shelley's monster, but her father, the philosopher and political theorist William Godwin, expressed the same sentiment in his novel, Caleb Williams. Caleb declares himself, quote, cut off from the friendship of mankind, and, quoting again, a monster with whom the very earth groaned. In Hume and Godwin, to be cut off from the world is like being a monster. In Shelley's Gothic tale, the creature is born monstrous, but because he is shunned by everyone, he also becomes a moral monster. It is the desperate yearning for company that spurs vengeance in Frankenstein's creature, a traumatized being whose repeated attempts to reach out to others are rebuffed. Quote, I do know, he says, that for the sympathy of one living being, I would make peace with all. I have love in me, the likes of which you can scarcely imagine, and rage, the likes of which you would not believe. If I cannot satisfy, hard to link such feelings to the person who by sex, class, or race, or religion is an outsider, a person regarded as unworthy and less than others. When Frankenstein was written, debates about slavery were roiling in England. The horrors of the slave ships that hauled human beings as chattel to English plantations were in the news and being adjudicated in the courts. In 1789, Allo da Equiano published his autobiography, which includes vivid and eloquent accounts of his brutal enslavement. The book created a sensation and was translated into many languages. The Shelleys were abolitionists. The violent rebellion the creature mounts against the world that refuses to accept him has obvious political meanings. The successful revolution in Haiti against the French and British was fought between 1791 and 1804, 12 years before Mary began her novel. Slave revolts were real and frightening to colonists. Shelley's creature has yellow skin and lustrous black hair, which contrasts sharply with the pallor of the English people. His distorted features and sallow skin suggest, but do not denote any racial category, but they are cast in an undesirable light during a period when scientists were busy creating a human hierarchy marked by skin color. Shelley does not imbue her creature with intellectual inferiority. In time, he suffers the disease of the learned and lonely. He reads Plutarch, Milton, and Goethe, and absorbs ideas about the effects climate and geography have on various peoples from the writer C.F. Volney, whose book, The Ruins of Empire, 1791, was another popular hit. This is from the novel, Frankenstein. I heard of the slothful Asiatics, the creature says, of the stupendous genius and mental activity of the Grecians, of the wars and wonderful virtue of the early Romans, of their subsequent degeneration, end quote. Civilizations go up and down. The creature's wish to have stayed in his native wood, untouched by knowledge, resonates with the belief that some primates might be humans in a state of nature. Rousseau reflected on this possibility. Maybe, he speculated, the orangutan was a race of genuine wild men. Linnaeus placed the H. sylvestris orang-utang in the genus Homo, not Homo sapiens, but Homo troglodytes, rather than in the category Simia. The fact that this strikes us as bizarre today acts as a warning against the slippery reality of classification itself. Damned to seclusion, the creature teeters between nature and culture, inhuman and human. He lives in an untenable state of betweenness in a world of boxes. Although he begs for a mate, Frankenstein, who is not only negligent mother and father to him, but his godlike creator, denies him an Eve. The giant is a sexual outcast too, a body that cannot be loved and will never reproduce. And I'm going to turn off this little guy here so we don't, just to come back. Okay. He begs for a mate. This is where I was, who is not only a negligent mother and father to him, but his godlike creator. He denies him an Eve. The giant is a sexual outcast, too, a body that cannot be loved and will never reproduce. He fits in nowhere and is therefore a nameless no one. The creature with all too human thoughts and feelings is denied his humanity because he is not recognized by a single other person. The real horror of the book lies in the creature's degeneration and ruin. He is not born, but becomes a monster. This transformation is possible in narrative because a story represents time, and time means change and movement. The creature starts his life as one thing, but becomes another. As I noted earlier, it is hard to push the imagination into a box if it hops around from one position to another. Dynamic reality, the fact that living creatures are always changing, is never easy to codify. Margaret Cavendish insisted that nature is in constant motion, not as a clock ticks or machine wheels turn, but as a living, relational reality, every part communicating with another part, none of which has knowledge of the whole. She refused to create a ladder of worth and noted that different creatures organize their worlds differently. Bees have a monarchy and ants a republic. A way to categorize time in nature is to create stages that divide up a lifetime or longer evolutionary progression. The stages are artificial, but they clarify change. Vico's giants are poetic beings at one stage of history who resemble infants and children. Rousseau's natural man is like the prepubescent Emile. In biology, the burgeoning science that informed Frankenstein, change can be so dramatic it's called metamorphosis. Egg, tadpole, tadpole with legs, froglet, frog. Unlike a chart or map that represents a static taxonomy, stages describe a narrative motion from frog beginning to maturity. There is no story if there is no change, and change, gradual or dramatic, happens in time. In his book, Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, 1986, Jerome Bruner argues that there are two modes of thought, each providing ways of ordering experience, of constructing reality. One he calls the logico-scientific mode, quote, which attempts to fulfill the ideal of a formal mathematical system of description and explanation, end quote. The other is narrative, which organizes experience in time by linking one event to another. Both are forms of knowledge, and I would add, are not easily kept separate. Linnaeus established a rigorous taxonomy, but he anthropomorphized his plants and gave them erotic stories of adultery and perversion. And his grouping of human character by region was little more than an application of European stereotypes to geography. Even mathematical ideals, as Poincaré pointed out, are sometimes shattered by monsters. Mary Shelley's mother was the philosopher and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, you remember from yesterday, who died 11 days after she gave birth to Mary. When the daughter began writing Frankenstein, she was still a teenager, 19 years old. She first outlined the story in June of 1816 in a villa on Lake Geneva in Switzerland that had been taken for the summer by the poet Lord Byron, who had invited Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, her lover, the poet Percy Shelley, and Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont, who was pregnant with Byron's child, to the area. Mary had run away with Percy when she was 16. He was then 22 and married to Harriet Westbrook, with whom he had 2 children. Only months after the couple's summer visit to Lake Geneva, the abandoned Harriet drowned herself. Mary and Percy became husband and wife. Mary Godwin, who begins writing a novel about a monstrous birth in 1816, is estranged from her father, who is angry about her elopement. She has given birth to a daughter, Clara, who lived for just 12 days and is breastfeeding her second child, the 5-month-old William. William will die too. 3 of the 4 children Mary gives birth to die. Her husband will drown in a boat accident when he is 29. During that rainy summer on Lake Geneva, Mary dreams that her dead child, Clara, is brought back to life by warming her body near the fire. I am telling you this story about a group of young radicals and their messy love affairs and sorrows for a reason. The fantastic myth born of Mary Shelley's imagination cannot be separated from her mourning the mother she never knew and her terror of pregnancy as a harbinger of death and grief. Nor can it be separated from the young woman's prodigious learning. They are of a piece, which is to say, the philosophical history of chopping up human beings into low-feeling bodies and high-reasoning, dry minds makes little sense. Without an understanding of Mary Shelley's situation, can we penetrate the imaginative, metaphorical motions that create what she called her hideous progeny, the novel Frankenstein? Can we separate the sensations and emotions represented in the book, those supposedly born of imagination, from the philosophical speculation that informs the story, supposedly born of reason? Doesn't Frankenstein partake of the transformation Vico called poetic logic, the movement from feeling to sign or signs? If we want to understand the imagination in human life, development is important. When does imagination start? Is it an inherited, inborn quality, which we should now call genetic? Recent scientific papers claim to have identified potential genes for creativity, a quality closely tied to imagination. Was the teenager Mary Shelley gifted by her genes? Was she like Georg Büchner, the great dramatist and poet, dead at 23, a genius by nature? Was Arthur Rimbaud, who began publishing poems at 15 and stopped writing them at 21, whose work remains sacred in French literature, a genetic wonder? What role did their experience play in who they became? Can we separate their genes from what they lived? I often hear people say, it's in the DNA. By this, they mean it's an unchanging, fixed, static quality. Like Plato's forms and Descartes' innate ideas, genes have assumed a role linked to the mind soul in Western thought. DNA is there from the beginning of life to its end and can be transferred to the next generation. Ideas may change, but they often carry on in new guises. Metaphors matter, as Evelyn Fox Keller, the philosopher of science, has argued. The fact that genes have been called a code, a program, or blueprint, an unchanging sequence of letters that define life itself, has lifted genes out of the natural world and made them a disembodied force, an immaterial mind controlling matter, a godlike agent for what we become. Like Plato's very important, like Plato's rational soul, Aristotle's form that animates inert matter, and Descartes' unextended mind, genes have become weirdly detached from bodies. DNA has been called the master molecule, a dictator for every individual, the force that makes you, you, and me. The metaphors have created a monster, which exists in many languages as a synonym for genetic determinism. 21st century molecular biology has altered this conception of the gene. The decoding of the genome that was supposed to reveal a direct correspondence between a gene or genes and a trait or illness, intelligence, creativity, or cancer, has resulted in further mysteries. Genes do not code directly for traits. And although the DNA sequence remains the same, other factors are involved in human becoming. The field of epigenetics studies modifications to DNA that affect the expression of genes. A discipline called social epigenomics is studying how social experiences affect human genes and biology. Falling ill with the learned disease, prolonged grief, exposure to racism and sexism day in and day out, and brutal loneliness have all been linked to gene suppression and increased risk of disease. This is called gene-environment interaction. And yet, parsing the influence of genes as opposed to environment by elaborate mathematical statistical methods has proved difficult. Those who seek purely genetic influences are continually worried about contamination from environmental factors. But what if the categories, genes and environment, like mind and body, constitute a false separation to begin with? What if interaction, a noun that supposes a division, doesn't describe what is happening very well either? The now ubiquitous distinction between nature and nurture is not that old. It was coined by the Englishman Francis Galton in the 19th century. Galton was convinced he could quantify how much nature and how much nurture went into making a human being. He was the first person to study twins. He, like many scientists who came before him, thought large heads were a sign of intelligence, an idea that has never disappeared. Papers on skull and brain size and their relation to intelligence are still being published. Galton invented a statistical method, the correlation coefficient, you may have run into this, to sort out the difference between heredity and environment. The man was a maniacal tabulator and categorizer. He also founded eugenics, a term he invented from the Greek for well-born. He believed that if you could control reproduction by breeding the right people from good stock with one another, you could make a better world. Galton's work makes it clear that nature wins in the nature-nurture war, and white men are superior to all other people and to women. Eugenics bloomed in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century and reached its zenith in the Holocaust. It was not exclusively a right-wing phenomenon. There were progressives and socialists who were eugenicists too. But it is a serious error to regard eugenics as a pseudoscience or a sad chapter in genetic research. It was a respected science. Eugenics became pseudoscience when the word fell from our vocabulary in disgrace to be used when we gaze back at a bygone era, confident that it has nothing to do with us. In his 1932 book, Nature versus Nurture, a year before Hitler came to power, an Englishman with the wonderful name Lancelot Hogben wrote, quote, "Genetical science has outgrown the false antithesis between heredity and environment, productive of so much futile controversy of the past," end quote. Hogben was a devoted anti-eugenicist, a socialist, and an adept statistician, locked in a battle with a far more famous statistician and eugenicist, Sir Ronald Aylmer Fisher, whose contributions to statistics and genetics are legendary. Many descriptions of Fisher do not mention his racism, advocacy of sterilization for the mentally defective, that's a quote, mentally defective, or his correspondence before and after the war with Ottmar Baron von Verscheuer, a racial hygienist who received scientific materials, that's another quote, from his student Dr. Mengele, who worked at Auschwitz. Fisher is a striking example of how perfect logic can lead to hideous progeny. Hogben's dispute with Fisher turned on category. Fisher ignored what Hogben felt was a crucial confounding third factor, a between problem. Fisher made his statistical calculations without attention to what happens when what Hogben called a third variable, I'm quoting Hogben, arises from the combination of a particular hereditary constitution with a particular kind of environment, end quote. To explain what he meant, Hogben pointed to Joseph Krafka's experiment in 1920, which demonstrated that fruit flies raised at varying temperatures developed different numbers of eye facets on their compound eyes. Recall the clownfish that changes sex over its lifetime. The social world of the clownfish is organized hierarchically by size. The biggest fish has the power and orders all the smaller fish around. Cavendish would have called their arrangement a monarchy. They are ruled by one huge female. When she dies, the largest male fish changes into a female and takes her place. The sex of other species of fish is dependent on water temperature, which means that climate change is now playing havoc with the sexual identities and reproduction of some fish. My argument following Hogben is that to cut the fish from their social reality or larger ecosystem is problematic. Temporal, relational, and situational qualities alter reality. Where exactly do we draw the borders between one thing and another? When do the categories we have established collapse altogether? Behavioral geneticists are still busy calculating degrees of nature and nurture and assigning numbers to each side. The controversy over the false antithesis has never ended. A major problem with the perspective adopted by Galton, Fisher, and their many heirs is they ignore time, development, and change. Human beings are not clownfish, but we are subject to remarkable changes from fertilized cell or zygote to adult. And those changes may be described as a complex mélange of processes that include the genome and its immediate cellular environment, but also that cell's communication with other cells and what is happening outside the person as a whole. In a 2003 paper, the psychologist Gilbert Gottlieb wrote, I'm quoting, "There can be no genetic effects on behavior independent of the environment, and there are probably no environmental effects independent of genetic activity," end quote. Gottlieb's criticism of the statistics derived from behavioral genetics and their tabulations of heritability and environment is that human development is left out of the picture. The statisticians are trying to quantify a moving target as if it were standing still. What Brunner called logico-scientific mode has long had a tendency to make rigid what is fluid. The boxes inside the taxonomies we use to divide up the world lose their status as maps, charts, and models. Imaginary distinctions harden and are treated as real, timeless properties of one thing or another. Frankenstein's creature was shocked to life, but the book depicts a metaphorical pregnancy. First, the seed of the scientist's obsessive idea, then his seclusion in a secret laboratory, followed by intense labor and birth. Although fertilization can now take place in a laboratory, gestation is not possible without a female body. First, there is a zygote, a diploid cell with genetic material from both parents. Those cells multiply to become a traveling ball of cells, a morula, which continues to multiply until it qualifies as a blastocyst, which is then taken in by the lining of the mother's uterus, after which the embryonic part of those cells and the placental part further differentiate. The placenta will become the between organ of pregnancy and orchestrate nutrition, waste disposal, and cellular exchange between maternal and fetal systems. It will deliver crucial hormones to the fetus and keep the blood systems of fetus and mother separate. But it does not take over the job as mediator until the second trimester of pregnancy. For the first 3 months, the embryo takes nourishment directly from the secretions of its mother's uterus. Until recently, the placenta has been mostly ignored. Much remains unknown about its functions, and I suspect that its status as a between is in part to blame. Philosophical reflections on this phase of human becoming have focused on when we can call a person, when life begins. These meditations are crucial to legal, medical, and political controversies, and they are often framed as if the woman is a stage set for spontaneous generation and curiously uninvolved in the process. They turn on how to categorize the stages of embryonic development. In When Did I Begin? Conception of the Human Individual in History, 1988, Norman M. Ford writes, quote, "We need to discriminate between the development of a multicellular individual and a mass of genetically human cells in the process of developing into a multicellular individual." End quote. In When Does Life Begin? John Merritt and John Lawrence Merritt II, apparently a father and son team here, write, quote, "Human life begins shortly after implantation of the blastocyst on day 8 after fertilization," end quote. David Alvar Gonzalez makes an Aristotelian argument for a substance essential change that takes place when the blastocyst is implanted in the uterus. One kind of thing becomes a whole other kind of thing and falls into another category. I find myself continually astounded by the confidence of these declarations. Pregnancy is a dance of complex relations inside a single person. The mother's bodily systems, her embryo and placenta, are interdependent, and the maternal body, occupied by a growing embryo and then fetus, is constantly adjusting to realities inside and outside itself. The word for those adjustments is homeostasis, a self-regulating physiological process that maintains an organism's stability. The woman is not aware of most of this, but she is certainly aware of the changes to her body and the feelings attendant to those changes. After 9 months of bodily metamorphoses, she goes into labor and pushes the newborn out of her. After she delivers the placenta, the umbilical cord is cut. The neonate, however, is wholly helpless and needs other people to survive. In the story of human development, there are few states as confounding to classification as pregnancy. Is it one person inside another, 2 persons? Is it one person harboring what may become another person? Is it an unfolding story of becoming during which one thing becomes another? Pregnancy is a narrative of increasing differentiation and separation of the maternal and the fetal domains through the mediation of the placenta. But throughout the process, the embryo and then fetus is literally attached to its mother in various ways and relies on the maternal body for nourishment? Is it possible to talk of self and other when the other is part of or connected to your body? What category of human experience is this? Western philosophy has mostly ignored pregnancy and its meanings, which qualifies as an astounding case of amnesia. The truth that every person was inside and physiologically connected to another person has hardly been discussed. Edmund Husserl, 1859-1938, who founded phenomenology, is among the few to do so. I'm quoting Husserl. "The child inside the mother," he wrote, "do we not have to do with an intermingling of primordialities that does not depend on empathy? Does the mother, among her own inner sensory fields, also have those of the child, its sensibility of movement, its kinesthesia? But if that is not the case, then what kind of community is it?" End quote. Husserl developed the idea of intersubjectivity, what happens between people in a shared world. Edith Stein, a student of Husserl's, who wrote an important philosophical text on empathy, refers to empathy as a foreign experience. It is dependent on separation. Pregnancy muddles this separation and the question of empathy. For me, for you in me, which is why Husserl is wondering how to understand it. The 20th century French philosopher of phenomenology, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908-1961, who was influenced by Husserl, outlined a vigorous philosophy of embodiment. He rejected Descartes' mind-body dualism and argued that we are our bodies. We are body subjects immersed in a world. And following Husserl, maintained that much of what we do is pre-reflective, not conscious, a function of our embodied reality, what Husserl called operational intentionality. He pointed out that many of our actions are the result of experience that have become habit. Once we learn to swim, we do not have to think about it anymore. It becomes a body memory, as Thomas Fuchs puts it. We do not think about how to turn on the light or raise a glass of water to our mouths. It is part of our way of being without thought. To Descartes' "I think," Merleau-Ponty retorted, "I can." He also invented a word to describe our embodied relations, intercorporeality. We do not relate to others as locked minds hidden from us, minds we can only penetrate by conscious analogy. "Oh, I remember what it's like to be angry. Therefore, I can see you are angry." Rather, I understand you as an embodied being like me and feel your presence in me. Communication, the philosopher wrote in Phenomenology of Perception, or the understanding of gestures, is achieved through the reciprocity between my intentions and the other person's gestures, and between my gestures and the intentions which can be read in the other person's behavior. Everything happens as if the other person's intentions inhabited my body, or as if my intentions inhabited his body, end quote. Self and other are entwined. Man, Merleau-Ponty wrote, is a network of relations. The involuntary smile that comes to your mouth when you see someone smile or yawn, and the yawn that you can't suppress when your neighbor is suddenly overcome by exhaustion, These are modes of intercorporeality. I see you take out your cell phone, and before I know it, I've picked up mine. Yawns, smiles, all kinds of actions seem to travel from one body to another. Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution is a bulwark of science, wrote about mimicry in nature and understood it as part of a continuum from plants to animals, of which we humans are a part. No one doubts that people are imitative creatures or that our experience of others includes sympathy, pity, and empathy, that we imagine the feelings of others, their pain, joy, or fury. The fights are about how we do this. Merleau-Ponty used a metaphor to describe this mutuality. Each of us, he wrote, is pregnant with others and confirmed by them in his body. Although Merleau-Ponty was never able to situate pregnancy in his philosophy, I think it haunted his philosophical imagination as an unconscious imaginative presence. Listen to his quote again. As if the other person's intentions inhabited my body, or as if my intentions inhabited his body, end quote. He never asked how actual pregnancy might play a role in the feeling of being inhabited or by inhabiting another. But then few have. The French philosopher Luce Irigaray, the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, and the historian Barbara Duden are exceptions. Recently, however, interest has been growing. And yet, pregnancy is missing from most theories of embodiment, even as a metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson of Metaphors We Live By, that I mentioned yesterday, who argued we think in metaphors that rise from our situated bodily experiences, make much of the container metaphor. I didn't see that point in your argument, is an example they use. The argument is a metaphorical container for points. They never mention pregnancy and birth, despite the fact that most conventional image for pregnancy in many cultures is as a container. Further, in the West, at least since Plato, human beings have been giving metaphorical birth to ideas, books, schemes, plots, etc. Did they just forget? The many thinkers who have embraced the 4 E's, who maintain the mind is embodied, embedded in a place, enacted in our behaviors, and extended beyond our skin, do not mention pregnancy either. It is not even a ghost. In his last unfinished book, Merleau-Ponty developed a concept of the flesh, which is mysterious but fundamental, and the idea of intertwining or chiasm. Pregnancy might be thought of as a literal intercorporeal state or chiasm of one wrapped into the other, of physiological attachments and interactions that shape our becoming, a story of multiple between states. More radically, it might be regarded as a state of ambiguity, a term Merleau-Ponty used in his philosophy to express the inability to separate subject and object, or the changes that take place in time, sometimes radical changes. Both describe pregnancy. Ambiguity is not a bad word in his philosophy. It surely applies to human beginning in the maternal, a blind spot in our philosophies created by a lack in the cultural imagination. In late pregnancy, the other is felt as a moving presence in the mother's own bulging body, an unseen but not unexperienced being. And that imminent baby is imagined by the mother with pleasure or fear or a mixture of both, Mary Shelley's fears became the metaphorical engine for Frankenstein, the birth of a monster. As pregnancy moves towards its conclusion, anticipation of the new person grows. When I was in the final month of my pregnancy, I had a dream that my obstetrician pulled the almost ready to be born infant out of my vagina just for an instant so I could see her. And then she promptly pushed it back inside. In the dream, my body provided her with a convenient sliding drawer that could be opened and shut at will. Sigmund Freud argued, dreams are wishes. In this particular instance, he was surely right. I wanted to look at that baby. Didn't the dream provide an imaginative way for me to catch a glimpse of my child? Mary Shelley's dream of her dead child coming to life was another imaginative wish. The meaning of those wishes began with feeling, the longing for an impossible something that is experienced in the dream. You will not be surprised to hear that philosophers and scientists argue over how to classify dreams. Are they hallucinatory or imaginative? How do we define either category? I wonder why we must choose one or the other. Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of the imagination is a little murky. Sometimes it seems to be an essential part of all perception, and other times not. Despite gargantuan efforts by scholars to beat his ideas into rigid shapes, I suggest that the imagination is ambiguous in his thought. What I've tried to present, from boxes to monsters to clownfish to the hopeless task of dividing genes and environment to pregnancy as a forgotten, dynamic, ambiguous state of our animal reality, is that our categories matter. They shape the collective imagination in ways that can be dangerous, but people also resist categories and dismantle them. And it is possible to do that, and it is not possible to do that without imagination, without envisioning, feeling, and articulating what such a world would look, sound, feel, smell, and taste like. And that is it. Thank you for hanging in for a while. Thank you, thank you. It's a little, just how to, oh, now I hear. Oh, no, now I don't hear.
Siri, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Who would like to start? Kommen Sie einfach nach vorne. Yeah. Okay. Somebody is arriving.
Okay, good.
Hello, my name is Paula. So when you told us about Frankenstein, you touched this point of us human beings wanting to belong and to fit in into categories, into groups of people. But I see kind of a contradiction, because at the same time we all want to be special, to have some individual features which makes us different to other people. So I just wanted to ask you what you think of this contradiction, what we can, or how we can make the best of it.
Well, I think actually there's another philosopher who was a close friend of Merleau-Ponty's, and it's Simone de Beauvoir, that most of you know, who wrote The Second Sex. But she also wrote an essay called The Ethics of Ambiguity. And what she points out is that there is this essential ambiguity in human experience, right? It's between being a subject and an object to others, right? So the subject object, there's something ambiguous there. Just the way the mind-body distinction is ambiguous because, you know, it's very hard to think about our thoughts as not independent. So this experience that you're saying, we want to be part of the group. And if we're not part of the group, it can be really terrible. But we don't want to be just like everybody else. We want to distinguish ourselves, which is part of a desire for autonomy, right? For forms of independence. And if you think of human life as a movement from, you know, total, you know, dependence inside the body of somebody else to real dependence early on in life, right? If you're not held and hugged and carried around, you'll die. But as time goes on, there's greater and greater autonomy. But that doesn't mean that you're still not, you know, part of a collective society. And one of the reasons I talked about the DNA fantasies is that, you know, that kind of use of science plays into this fantasy of the unique me, right? But in fact, what goes into being a unique me is many, many factors that play together. And that ambiguity, if we don't recognize those forms of dependence and forms of autonomy, I think we can run into problems. You know, you have then the self-made man. Like, nobody's self-made, right? Let's all recognize this. We're all born out of someone else, and if people don't take care of us, we die. But that doesn't mean that there aren't aspects, independent aspects of our lives, that we don't make choices, right? But I think if we can articulate to ourselves exactly what you're doing now, this tension exists, I think, in every life. And then if you're asking moral questions, you have to decide what is more important at various moments in your life, right? To be part of, or for whatever reason to separate yourself from. It's tough. I think we're making these decisions all the time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are there further questions? Who would like to ask the following question? Ja, bitte. Siri, before you will be asked the following question, Thomas Fuchs is just saying goodbye. Thomas Fuchs, may I ask you just to say hello and goodbye to Siri? You have to go here.
Hi, Siri.
Hey.
Pleasure to see you, at least for a short moment. I'm going to look at the presentation on YouTube, I think, because our presentations and another presentation that I have overlapped. So unfortunately, I couldn't follow you, but I will look at the YouTube presentation then.
Me too. That's what I'm going to do with you.
Anyway, good to see you. And
Nice to see you too. So one of these new opening months, we'll see each other at another conference or event, or no doubt.
yes. So enjoy the lecture. Well, enjoy the discussion. Young people are very lively here and very interested, and it's a pleasure to discuss these issues. And I think you're going on with that tomorrow. So enjoy it.
Thank you. I will. I do.
Goodbye, Siri.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello, thank you for this lecture. You touched the topic of the human as a creator, and I think, yeah, there's no question that we are, but we only create our own children, like the bodies, and we actually don't know how this works. So I think it's a nature rule that we're not able to give life to something technical, like technical bodies like Frankenstein or something. Yeah, I think that's a nature rule, and we're not meant to cross this border. What's your opinion on it?
Well, this is, of course, what you just brought up relates to, I think, Mary Shelley's fear. Her writing of Frankenstein was a treatment of scientific hubris. You know, the idea that scientists can create life. Now, I have actually written about this, about the kind of story of AI that is predated by all kinds of fantasies about producing, you know, life, that go back to Greek stories, you know, Pygmalion, the sculpture that comes to life. And I think that it is related. The AI fantasies, there is no evidence to suggest at all that anything like general intelligence can be reproduced in machines. Machines can do marvelous things, but you're absolutely right that at this moment, there is no evidence that whatever that life presence and consciousness is, it ain't happening. I mean, there are lots of AI. People say, why can't it happen? What's wrong? Well, I think their models are wrong. And they are, you know, they're having immortality fantasies that have gone on for a long time. They're also having fantasies of male birth, right? I mean, this is in the Frankenstein. He gets to have a baby. And a lot of AI people talk about the machines that are going to come to life using the parental metaphor. And, you know, most of these people are men. So I think this is a driving force, but you're absolutely right. There is a difference between natural material, living organisms, and you know, wires and copper and silicon and everything that's used in computers. And this is now an argument in philosophy of biology. What is agency, right? Now, how is it that cells know what to do and where to go? They clearly have some form of agency that, you know, this plug doesn't. So these are big questions that you're asking, and there's a lot written about it, but nobody knows. But I agree with you entirely. We are on the same page and side of this question.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Are there further questions?
All right.
Yeah, hello. My question is, earlier talking about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, you also talked about how this novel would never happened if she didn't have like her backstory. And so the question I'm asking myself is if it is even possible to separate the art from an artist, if human being can't be objective and therefore brings every experience he ever has had into his art or conversations or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, this is again, these are big questions. I think, there was a fashion, especially this death of the author, in France, the Roland Barthes idea that the author's dead. Well, anyway, you might be too young to even care about this because I think it's passed away mostly. But the making of art is not a fully conscious activity. I mean, that is as clear as day. In fact, I don't think writing essays or doing science is a fully conscious activity either. You are using aspects of yourself that you don't fully understand to make something, whether it's, an essay, a formula or a poem, a piece of music. And what you have is a concentrated effort that is relaxed enough to be open to all kinds of material coming from your memory, coming from stimulation around you, and it's usually driven by something that is meaningful, right? And when I say meaningful, that means there has to be some emotional value to it, right? So, and often those emotionally meaningful things have some conflicted aspect to it, right? It's like in the dream, it's not always just, oh yeah, you want to look at the baby, so let's open you up and shove the drawer in and out. So yes, I think it's silly to pretend that the experience that an artist has plays no role in their art, but also to recognize, just as Vico talks about, there's a metaphorical translation of that meaningful emotional material into something that can look quite different, like Frankenstein. I mean, Mary Shelley obviously, had no access to anything like that, but she had read a lot of science and she had her fears, and they get translated into this remarkable fable about an isolated and marginalized monster. Does that help at all?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, good.
Hi, I'm Teresa, and you talked about those boxes and that imagination is between those boxes, and I asked myself if you think that trust can be placed in one of those boxes, and I wonder if trust is just an imagination itself or a fantasy or wish that a person has a positive effect on ourselves.
So you wonder if trust is something that has a positive. Can you say it? Just try to rephrase it just a little bit again.
Okay. Do you think that trust is a category itself, or is it just
a thing between two people, or a thing between in the space of those people? And is it just a fantasy and an imagination of a perfect effect or a perfect person? Yeah, and
No,
and the wish.
I think I understand you now.
Okay.
I do, right? So we can think of it in two ways. One is that it's clear that we have trust as a category, right? If you read a sentence and it says trust is important in human relations, right? We go, okay, trust is one of the ingredients that's important in human relations. Then there's the actual phenomenological experience of trust. And how do you set that up? Well, you're not just trusting alone, right? So you need to have two people, at least two. You can have bigger things, right? You need two. And then what you're exploring is a between, a relational reality that can only happen between two people, right? If you don't, I mean, I guess people talk about trusting oneself and et cetera, but then you're also even setting up yourself as if it were another, right? So, so this relational, or what Merleau-Ponty called, this intersubjective or intercorporeal reality is also taking place in time, right? So let's say you have person A and person B, and there's a moment when they have established a kind of reliable, trusting relationship, right? And then that relationship can be broken. And once it's broken, then repair will either happen or not happen. But in some way, in these lectures, I'm trying to get everybody to think in terms of human experience as a dynamic, moving thing and not fixed. You know how people say, and then, to achieve happiness. I heard that in America anyway, people say, to achieve happiness, that's my goal. I want to achieve happiness. Well, nobody achieves happiness. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad, right? You don't reach trust. It's like you don't say you have a lover or, boyfriend, girlfriend, a spouse. You don't achieve trust. It's like an ongoing thing that's being negotiated day in and day out. It can become very fragile if one partner is betraying the other right and left, or it can be reconsolidated in other ways. So this fantasy of endpoints or dismissing time is something that I think is not healthy for human thinking, right? It's partly because of fictions. You watch a movie, it's like a romantic comedy, and then boom, it's over, and the whole thing ends, and the great boy and girl, or girl and girl, or boy and boy, or whoever have gotten one another, and love triumphs. But of course, these are ongoing trusts, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Siri, time flies.
It does, it does.
But we are looking forward to continue that conversation tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to having your next lecture tomorrow. Then we will have another conversation and discussion, and then we will have the ending as we announced it to you in our mails. Okay, so it's time to say goodbye for today. and you will hear the people clapping, and that's the goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.